timeless voices of the eternal church.
Mark the Evangelist. It is presumed by most students in the Bible, as well as later historians, that the young man referred to as John Mark in the book of Acts is the same person referred to as Mark by the apostles Paul and Peter in their letters to various churches. This is important because the references in the epistles give us clues to the maturing of a well-meaning but inconsistent young man. When we first meet Mark in Acts, he could be called a disciple of the apostles. A cousin of Barnabas, Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas first to Antioch, then on the first leg of their first missionary journey. He was also Barnabas' choice for the second missionary journey, but Paul took Silas instead, and Barnabas took Mark to preach the gospel in Cyprus. Mark's family also assisted Peter. His mother Mary opened her home regularly as a meeting place for the disciples and held an all-night prayer meeting for Peter when he had been put in prison. Unfortunately, young Mark had a reputation for cutting out when things got tough. The Gospel of Mark tells a brief story about a young man who was following along behind the disciples when Jesus was arrested. The mob tried to grab him, but he wiggled out of his clothes and ran away stark naked. Pretty understandable. The mob was hot for blood. Even the disciples ran away that night. But apparently, Apostle Paul didn't understand when John Mark cut out on him and Barnabas after just a couple stops on their first missionary journey and went back to Jerusalem. Deserted was the word Paul used when arguing with Barnabas about whether to take Mark on the second missionary journey. Barnabas, being the encourager he was, took young Mark under his wing and sailed for Cyprus. That's the last we heard about Mark in the book of Acts. What happened to him? Did he deserve the second chance Barnabas gave him? About 10 years later, the church in Colossae received a letter from Paul, who was in prison. At the end of the letter, Paul wrote, "Aristarchus, who is in prison with me, sends you his greetings, and so does Mark, Barnabas' cousin. And as you were instructed before, make Mark welcome if he comes your way." Colossians 4 verse 10. When Paul was released from prison, he wrote to Timothy, "Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me." 2 Timothy 4 verse 11. And to Philemon, Paul wrote, "Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you his greetings. So do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my co-workers." Philemon 23 and 24. Mark has gone from persona non grata to helping Paul while he was in prison, being sent on Paul's behalf to the Colossians, and was described as helpful to me and my co-worker. And when Peter writes to the scattered Jewish believers in his first letter in 1 Peter 5 verse 13, which states, "Your sister church here in Rome sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark," we can deduce two things from this. Mark had been traveling with Peter, and they had a very close relationship, like father and son. As Peter's assistant, Mark wrote down a compilation of Peter's teachings about Jesus and his ministry, which became known as the Gospel of Mark. Mark is a good example of a young Christian who learned perseverance from others. According to early historians, Mark was sent out by Peter to preach the gospel in Egypt. Though he traveled numerous places in Africa, his primary ministry took root in Alexandria, where he nurtured a fledgling Christian church. In the 8th year of Nero, the pagan priests of that city incited a riotous crowd that dragged Mark by ropes and hooks through the streets of the city until his skin had been ripped off by the stones. Thrown in prison overnight, he was dragged again through the city, and then his lifeless body was burned. Don't let anyone think less of you because you are young. Be an example to all believers in what you teach, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity. 1 Timothy 4 verse 12.
Reading from the complete book of Christian heroes, over 200 stories of courageous people who suffered for Jesus, compiled by Dave and Neta Jackson. This is the Eternal Church of Jesus Christ, the record.